Okay, we ran out of time before we could quite get finished with this quota, production quota example. But we got to the point where we calculated the total revenue, consumer surplus, variable costs, producer surplus. I don't want to forget to calculate the total benefit. The total benefit is an important thing, and that's just all the area under the demand curve over to 2 units here, right? So we could add up. The simplest way is the total revenue plus the consumer surplus, the blue plus the yellow. So let me just write that down so we have it here. Total surplus, not total surplus, total benefit, I apologize. Total benefit is equal to 2134 plus 133. That's going to be $22.37. So 22 and 37. Okay. Also, an important thing to keep track of. But we got down to the point where we got to what economists keep their eye on, and what economists track in markets for the most part is this total surplus, because the consumer surplus is a measure of how well off the consumers are in this market, and the producer surplus is a measure of how well off the producers are in this market. And so by adding them together, it's a rough way of measuring total happiness or total well-being. I mean, that's a little bit of a strange way to say it, but that's a way to try to remember what it is we're keeping track of. So we have $16.67 in total surplus. And that total surplus is the orange producer surplus here plus the yellow consumer surplus. Now let's look back at what did this picture look like before the production quota came into being. And this is what we did in lecture B. Here's what we had. The same demand and supply, but we were allowed to get to the quantity of 6. And so our consumer surplus and producer surplus in total was the large black triangle, still orange plus yellow here, but much bigger at 30 for the total surplus. And so what happened between this total surplus of 30 and this total surplus that is only $16.67? Well, what happens is we just chopped off this part of the surplus. Let me get a big marker here. It's like we chopped off that part over there, right? Because that used to be surplus, but now it's not surplus anymore. And so this blue patch that used to be consumer or producer surplus, but now is not created. Nobody gets these benefits because we're not allowed to buy and sell these units. That is called deadweight loss. And so let me draw it a little bit more cleanly so we can kind of see what we're doing here. So that is the deadweight loss. Now there are a couple ways you can calculate the deadweight loss, and we're going to do them both ways. It's good to be able to double check your answer here. The first way is we can just calculate the area of this blue triangle. Now this blue triangle, if you keep in mind that the total revenue, or the price up here that we use for total revenue, that's the top of that triangle, is at that price, which is $10.67. The bottom part of the blue triangle goes down to the other candidate price that we had there, which was 4 right there. And so the base of the blue triangle goes from 1067 down to 4. And so the base, if we think about it that way, is $6.67. And the height of this blue triangle is a line that we can draw right down the middle here from the old equilibrium down to the quantity that we are at now. So we were at a quantity of 6 and now we're at a quantity of 2. That gives us the height of that triangle that we've lost surplus that we call the deadweight loss. So we can calculate the deadweight loss as 1/2 times 667 on the bottom times 4 on the top. And so that's 2 times 667. And we get a deadweight loss when we calculate it that way. Let me write it over here. Deadweight loss of $13.34. So you can calculate the area of that triangle directly, deadweight loss. Now, there's another way to do it, which is actually the way I prefer, because it really makes you pay attention to what deadweight loss means. And the way I do it is I take the total surplus that we have after the government passes this quota. So right now we only have $16.67 in surplus. What did we used to have? Well, we used to have 30 in surplus when we had all of that as either consumer or producer surplus. So when you take the fact that we used to have 30, how much are we not getting anymore? Well, 30 minus the total surplus now, 1667, gives us, let me write that down, so the total surplus was 30. Subtract off the total surplus that we're getting now, which is less, the 1667, and you get an estimate of how much surplus did we lose. Well, we get 1334. Actually, we get 1333. I'm glad that I caught that, because I know that some of you are going to have a question. Why is it that if you calculate the deadweight loss by comparing how much total surplus we had before to how much we're left with now, we lose that 1333? If you compare it to this way, taking the area of the triangle directly, why do we get two different answers? Well, they're 1 penny off because we rounded this price here to $10.67. And because we rounded that a little bit, these answers are going to have a tiny bit of rounding error. But at least in my class, I encourage you to calculate these deadweight losses both ways. And if one's a penny off, that's great. That means that I know that you know what you're doing. So once again, just to recap, when you're allowed to get to the market equilibrium, then this total surplus triangle is going to be as large as it can possibly be. So when you have something like a production quota, it's like you're chopping off part of what used to be surplus. And so we're going to have a smaller amount of total surplus. And again, that's what economists keep their eye on. Now, one last question that economists will point out to people, but it's not the main point. The main point is what happens to total surplus. That goes from 30 down to 1667. Sometimes it's also interesting to see who gets hurt the most by this policy. Is it the consumers or the producers? Now again, mainstream theoretical economists don't care so much, but for policy purposes it can be important. We see that the consumer surplus was 12 before this policy was passed, and afterwards it's only $1.33. So consumers get hurt quite a bit. Now the producers, their surplus was 18, and now it's $15.34. And so they get hurt, but not quite as much. Now, sometimes it's actually possible, in this case, if the government had made the quota 3 or 4, it's probable, and we'll look at this later on, it's probable that this producer surplus would actually increase for the producer. And so sometimes you will see industries actually arguing for a quota, because sometimes by allowing them to push up their price, as long as the quantity doesn't go down too much, it'll increase their producer surplus. Now remember, producer surplus is the amount of money that you have after you pay your labor and materials costs, those variable costs, and the more money you have left over to pay your fixed costs, the bigger your profit's going to be if you have a profit. So businesses like to see their producer surplus as big as possible because that'll make their profit as large as possible. Now in the next section we're going to analyze a price ceiling and see how that compares.